Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to Civil War Seattle. We're doing the West Coast, Best Coast edition tonight, and I'm real proud and glad to welcome Keith Harris on this evening for a discussion about a topic near and dear to my heart and my research, which is ideas of reunion and reconciliation with veterans of the American Civil War. So to get started, while everybody's kind of filtering in here, Keith, why don't you introduce yourself, where you're from, your educational background, some of the work you've done, so people who are not familiar with you can get bearings on who you are.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Harris. I live in Los Angeles, California, and educationally, I got my undergraduate degree at UCLA, and I did my Ph.D. work with Gary Gallagher at the University of Virginia. And these days, after bouncing around a little bit, doing some adjunct work in the UC system, I found myself teaching at a private high school in Los Angeles, and I'm very happily ensconced there now. I'm fortunate in that we have the resources to teach an entire course on the American Civil War and Reconstruction, which includes a field trip to Gettysburg and every spring, and it's a good gig, so I'm very blessed in that way. But anyway, it's good to see everybody. So hello.
Well, my first question. That's great that you get to teach an entire course just on that at the high school level. Before we get too much further, I just got to ask, what's the enthusiasm, engagement, interest level with high school students on that topic for you?
Man, I tell you what, they dig it. This is a class I started about 7 years ago, and the enrollment was a little bit a little cautious at first, but then once it built up some steam in the second year, I've got a good sized enrollment, 2 sections of this. It's a full year-long thing, and I broadened it out. I even changed the title of the course now. Now it's the American Civil War and Reconstruction in American History. So I front load it very heavily with a long discussion on the Constitution and slavery and secession and the Constitution. And then we get to the war after 6 or so weeks of talking about that and Annabelle of America. And then War and Reconstruction, I spent a lot of time talking about Civil War memory and the legacy of the Civil War. And these days, that's very current in the news, and we're talking about monuments coming down, Confederate iconography being a very controversial topic these days. And so, it's in the news every day. It's in the Atlantic. It's in the New York Times. We're talking about this sort of thing all the time. And so the kids are very engaged. They're very involved. And for those who want to get into the humanities and really understand what critical thinking is all about and how to do well in college, doing that sort of thing, this class is sort of tailor-made for them, even if the subject matter isn't necessarily exactly what they want to pursue. The stuff that we talk about, the nuance and the complexity that we deal with, 3 times a week for an entire year, really prepares them for college and gets them ahead of the curve when they get there.
Yeah, wow, that's tremendous. Well, let me give everybody a glance at your book here, which takes a pretty prominent spot on my shelf. Let me get this straight so everybody can read it. Across the Bloody Chasm, Culture of Commemoration Among Civil War Veterans. When did this come out? It's Louisiana State University Press, LSU Press.
It came out in 2014.
Okay, so fairly recent.
It's a little older now, but I think it's holding up fairly well, even though there's a few things that I would probably revise if I were writing it today. I think it's held up pretty well. It gets cited all the time, and it was reviewed well, so that's good news. Yeah. The subtitle was not my idea. That was the publisher's idea. I really don't like it very much. The original subtitle was Civil War Commemoration. Or no, that's not either. It was Commemoration in the Wake of Civil War. I thought that was a snappier title, but they didn't. So,
yeah, I agree. I mean, now that you mention it, I don't know that the subtitle quite matches the book. I guess it's sort of like I see where you're coming from on that. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you then, how you came to that particular topic, that line of research, this thesis that you wanted to really work on. What was, what led you into that? What really triggered you to say, this has captivated me. This is the direction I want to go in. because it's a captivating topic for a lot of people, but it's not a particularly widely written about topic.
Right.
As far as the particulars of veterans thinking after the war and all the different topics that we'll talk about here going forward. But I'm curious how you found your way into it and what was the project that became the book? I guess that's.
I appreciate you asking that. Really, I mean, it goes all the way back to my undergraduate days at UCLA. I was studying under Joan Laude there, and she introduced me to the field of Civil War memory in the late 1990s.
Okay.
And I was drawn to that, reading books like, Gaines Foster's Ghosts of the Confederacy and Stuart McConnell's book on Civil War veterans. And then, of course, David Blight's book came out, Race and Reunion, I think in 2000 or 2001, and which was just a magnificent book in so many ways. And I read it, and I was very much drawn to the idea of how people remembered the Civil War experience, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And then so I wanted to read more about this. And as I read the veterans' remarks on their experiences in the war, both Union veterans and Confederate veterans, I found that I didn't really agree with David Blight's thesis completely. I think it's one of Blight's book, and he's a really cool guy that I've spoken to on many occasions about this. Very nice guy, a brilliant scholar. But I didn't think I don't think that he got it right on Civil War veterans. His premise, essentially what I call the reconciliation premise, is that Northern and Southern Americas came together on their shared racism and celebrated a reconciled nation, a vision of nationalism that sort of wrote, the issues out of the story at the expense of formerly enslaved people. And so it became the white narrative of the Civil War. And he's right about so many of those things. If you look at the Civil War centennial, for example, in 1960, 61 through 1964 and 65, it's a commemorative story that really only engages the white participants of that era. And so he's right in so many ways. But when it comes to the veterans, I don't think he got it right. I think he missed. He spoke about the 1913 Blue-Gray reunion in Gettysburg, which was very much scripted to have this sort of reconciliationist message. That was the one in 1938 at Gettysburg. These were scripted. They were done for the press, for the cameras, for reporters, and they were meant to show the world a reunited nation that had gotten over all of their past divisions. And so the divisions were mentioned in this particular case. But if you look, if you look at all the other commemorative events, local commemorative events in various towns across the North and the South, veterans gatherings, whether they be, for Memorial Day parades, or if they were at GAR meetings or UCD meetings or any of those veterans organizations meetings, that the message that they gave was very, very different from the message that Blight discussed in his book, Race and Reunion. In fact, it was almost the opposite of what he said. In fact, what I found was that Union veterans were very committed to their fight to both preserve the Union and to free a race of people from bondage. The only army really that has ever marched into the field as liberators in this way. And they were very proud of their accomplishments. They still held the kind of racist sensibilities that would make us cringe, here in the 21st century. They were not, after all, they were white men of the 19th century. They held on to these ideas about black inferiority, intellectual, moral inferiority, what have you. But they were still very proud of what they had done. They still believed that at the end of the day, slavery was immoral, and that they had done something special, and that was a feather in their cap. And so they patted each other on the back for it. On the other hand, white Southerners rejected this idea out of hand and talked about their vision as not a lost cause, but a cause that was just postponed temporarily. That principles mattered much more than defeat on the battlefield, and that their ideas held on. So they really didn't dismiss the divisive issues really at all, from how I understood things. Now, of course, I only looked at the kind of veterans who would give speeches and the kind of veterans who would be present at these meetings. So it's a smaller sample set, but these guys stood in for the broader number of folks, and with the numbers of people who joined these organizations, freely willing, and when you see the literature that was distributed among the veterans, you can see that that's the message that they sent. This is the message that you would embrace were you to join these groups. And so they didn't seem particularly reconciled in any practical way. They talked about reconciliation all the time, but what I found out is that whether you be a Union veteran or a Confederate veteran, you were perfectly fine with reconciliation, provided that your former enemy admitted that he was wrong.
Yes.
And of course, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, they're not going to admit that they're wrong. And so any genuine reconciliatory message is just, it doesn't exist. To me. This is all very surface level stuff. Yeah. And so that's what Across the Bloody Chasm is about. It's a short book. You could read it in a weekend very easily. I think it's it's organized as a sort of argument, between the two different sides as it goes through. And it takes it into, I wrote this, it's published in 2014, but it started off really honestly as an honors thesis in the early 2000s at UCLA. It moved into my master's thesis and then became my Ph.D. dissertation. Okay. That was finished around 2007, 2008. And as you know, the wheels of academic publishing can turn extraordinarily slowly. And so, it finally made its way to the shelves in 2014. So it's a book that is, the original incarnation of that book is going on 20 years old now. As often happens with these things, they're old ideas that finally, percolate to the surface. And there you go. Yeah.
Well, so let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. If this is something that I've wrestled with a little bit, is you talk about the idea that the Union veterans cling to and are very expressive. And I will say that you had mentioned, the numbers of these groups, but it's a limited sample size because these are the guys that are talking. So what they said is what got written down, not the 150 guys who didn't come to the meeting or weren't there to say anything. But I've noticed an incredible uniformity among thinking and expression, and almost like literally word for word sometimes between what veterans in Connecticut and veterans in Arizona and veterans here in Seattle and veterans in Topeka, Kansas are saying about these issues as they arise. But one thing that I've noticed and I've heard commented on, and I really want to know what you have to think, is that there's sort of a shift in the place in which the extinction of the institution of slavery, of the freeing of slaves and racial equality and civil rights to some degree, although like you said, that's way down the chain, but I see it expressed sometimes in Seattle by the veterans, things like that. But it seems like right after the war, it was more about putting down rebellion and treason. You see language like, disloyalty and treason constantly in the 1870s, 1880s literature. I mean, you don't see so much about slavery until the late 1890s, early 1900s. That was my perception of it. And do you see that historically that they latch on to different things conceptually as they age, or as the relationships between these veterans changes over the years? Because it does smooth out. Like they're certainly, these guys are getting along a whole lot better in 1921 when they're 85 years old than they were when they're 42 and still a little hot under the collar. So I know that it changes that way, but the importance of slavery as that justification and that triumph, how do you see that go over the decades after the war?
It's an interesting question. The first collection of Union veteran monument dedications that I ever purchased in of all places, the Gettysburg gift shop, was a collection of speeches for the veterans of New Jersey units, and they dedicated their monuments in the 1880s. Pretty much all of them in the 1880s. This the regimental monuments, not the state stuff. The regimental stuff. Yeah. And I found that they have a twin commemorative impulse, and it's both Union and Emancipation together. And this is New Jersey. This is the state that elected George McClellan as their governor, right? Mm-hmm. And that means something. I mean, these guys were not on board with emancipation in 1863 necessarily, and here they are talking about it now. If you read the old Presley book on Civil War, Americans and their Civil Wars, called Thomas Presley. This is an older book from the
Mhm.
1950s. He talks about this a lot, and he sort of dismisses it as moralizing self-righteousness. And I think that there's definitely some of that going on.
Mhm.
The way I see it is not that there's all of a sudden really super thrilled to be living among free black people,
Yeah.
because they would have been just as racist as they were in the 1860s and the 1880s.
Sure.
However, this is a really wonderful way for them to like rub the Confederate face in it, to say, ah, ha, ha. We know what you were doing, right? You were fighting to preserve this institution. And in our effort to suppress you traitorous rebel scum, we also did this. So how do you like that? And so I think it was just a way for them to dig one more little bit in the 1880s. And like you were saying, in the 1880s, these guys are still pretty annoyed. I mean, these are still young men in the 1880s, right? They're in their 30s, 40s, maybe 50s are the oldest. And so by the 1930s, these guys are old men, the ones that are still alive. I mean, they're really old men by this point. And so, yeah, they're probably less likely to be really antagonistic. But in the 1880s, they're still pretty fiery about this stuff, as you mentioned. And they talk about it's like a twin cause now, union and freedom together. Of course, this varies from place to place. Sometimes they won't mention it all, and sometimes they'll focus on it, and they'll really bring up a lot of evocative language about freeing, a race from bondage, and discussing the shackles and discussing the corporal punishments and the various other things that enslaved people had to endure. Talking about how they put an end to that, and as decent Christian Americans, that was the right thing for them to do, and all this sort of stuff. But I often wonder just how much of that, is genuinely heartfelt, and how much of it is like, just giving one last little jab to the Confederates while they had the papers were there.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed that with a lot of the jabs. So a lot of there's a lot of that public acknowledgement of at least with the veterans here in Seattle. And boy, did they had a lot of events where they got together and they gave orations on speeches together. Going back to 1891 is the first time that they're really creating events and speaking together. And you see a lot of that language where they would say, oh, we respect, that their commitment to their cause and their bravery on the battlefield, but they always throw a shot. The Union veterans, every single time they'll say, I'm glad to be shaking this, this Confederate's hand, and we've buried the hatchet, and we're here building these great West Coast cities together, and blah 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 blah. But man, he was wrong, and it was slavery, and he was part of a treasonous cause, the worst to ever exist on the face of the earth, or something. They always have that, so it's like it's interesting that they'll have that sort of like you said. There's this holiness about like their cause, but really, what is the motivation of emphasizing it the way that they do? Because they'll always throw their shot at the end. I find with these guys.
They take that. I mean, they're taking their cues right from U.S. Grant himself, who in his memoirs, published in 1885, said that the Confederate soldier was among the bravest, most stalwart. I'm paraphrasing here. I can't quote it exactly from memory, but along the lines of they fought as well as any soldier has ever fought for any cause. But then he goes on to say, but it was the worst cause that any soldier's ever fought for. And so this is straight from Grant. And I would think, I mean, this is a guy that's, on his mausoleum in New York, it says, let us have peace. That was his campaign slogan. I mean, there's no more reconciliationist individual than U.S. Grant. And he says these words. And so, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of that. And I think so many veterans kind of almost take that as boilerplate language that they employ, over the next several decades. Saying, when you can acknowledge that, sure, somebody stood up and fought for a cause that person believed in without question, and they fought bravely, and that's a virtuous thing to do, I suppose. And it's an American virtue, really, to stand up for what you believe in, to risk your life, to put everything on the line for something. I mean, the Continental Army and George Washington, it goes all the way back to that stuff, but let's not forget that they did these other things too, and those things are pretty important.
Yeah. I've had one of the things that I've really enjoyed reading about, I guess, in a national level, but especially here locally, is their reaction to, I believe it was 1897. There's a senator from Mississippi, I believe, that wanted to get a statue of Robert E. Lee in the rotunda at the Capitol building. Or maybe it was later, maybe it was early 1900s, whatever the 1907, whatever the year was. And of course, the veterans, Union veterans, weren't really having it in general. But I found some really specific things that were just so nuanced to me that it was really unexpected. And some GR posts here specifically in and around Seattle had some things to say about this. And of course, they mirror the sort of, we, the Grand Army of the Republic, resolved the blah, 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 and all the resolutions that these guys put out. But they were really specific with this Lee monument about saying, what offends us is that you're intent on portraying him in a Confederate general's uniform. Mm-hmm. That if he's the greatest son of Virginia and he's an upstanding man of saintly character and this, and he's the greatest product of Virginia soil, we would be cool with that because he's a great American and we respect him as a leader and convicted to his different beliefs of religion and so on. But man, you put that braid on his sleeve or those stars on his collars, and we can't tolerate that. It's a fine line for them to not just say no, Confederate monuments, we're not having it, where they're actually, the Union veterans they're subtle in their argument about what they're willing to accept and what's a bridge too far to cross like that. And did you find a lot of kind of almost conflicting statements like that when Union veterans are dealing with things in different ways? Because I'm reading that, I'm like, well, are you for or against it? I don't know. Clearly they're against it because they wrote the thing and saying that they were opposed to it, but they're also saying, well, but afterwards too.
Yeah, no, there's a great example that I spent a lot of time studying during my research for this book, and it was the Union veterans that weighed in on Grover Cleveland's administration when the Cleveland administration wanted to return captured battle flags back to Confederate regiments, the original owners, and Union veterans who were, their written literature suggests that they, we let bygones be bygones. We are together as one nation. We'll put it all behind us. We're friends. that usual stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then when Cleveland wants to return those flags, they lose it. They go ballistic on him. In fact, he gets death threats from Union.
Wow.
And it was especially annoying to them because Cleveland had purchased a substitute during the war and had spent the Civil War, as an attorney practicing law safely in Buffalo, New York. And so, he hired a Polish immigrant, a guy named George Brinsky, who survived the war and even tried to milk Cleveland for some extra money, claiming that he hadn't paid him the full fee and all this kind of other stuff, which is BS. But he tried because he'd not become president, so it was. But an interesting story in and of itself. But no, I mean it's remarkable, and it could even have lent to Grover Cleveland served 2 terms, but they were non-consecutive terms. It may have lent to his defeat the first time he was up for re-election. Yeah, I mean, part of it. A number of other things probably too, and is the only Democrat in office since James Buchanan. This a lot of Union veterans were very disappointed would be a light way of putting it. They're very upset that he made this reconciliatory gesture. They found it offensive. So you can make gestures. You can do that kind of thing all the time, but when it comes to something like that, it's offensive. And this is not anything that's gone away. The controversy to this day at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, for example, is another thing where people in the Lee Chapel, the chapel there, very very famous chapel with the recumbent Lee there at the front of the chapel, and there were Confederate flags of different varieties that were over there. They've taken those out, but there was a portrait of Lee that was next to that, and it was in uniform, and they were very upset about that. And so you take him out of the Confederate uniform, and that's you put him in his civilian clothes as when he was president of the university, and that's a different story. But it gets tricky. It gets really tricky when it comes to Confederate symbols.
Yeah, and it's that they view him so negatively for his role in treason and his overthrowing militarily the United States government. They're proclaiming their victory, and that's like we had talked about with the terms of ending slavery, but they don't hold him to account for that at the same time. And that reflects that their attitudes about it were what they were, that wasn't something they would necessarily hold against someone. Having been a Southern slave owner, they would look at it as a cause level, but maybe not an individual level like that. So,
yeah, I'm trying to think if Frederick Douglass went after Robert E. Lee quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
Frederick Douglass leaned on the treasonous aspect of it. Now, I'm pretty sure I have to go back and look and see what Douglass specifically said. He published a lot of stuff about Lee, and he was just perplexed as to why anybody in the North would celebrate this person as a virtuous character after what he'd done. I have to see how much he talks about the slaveholding aspects of Lee. There's been a lot of work on Lee the slaveholder, in the recent years. So an interesting story.
Well, here's something I'd like. We talked a little bit before we got started about your upcoming work and how this project has sort of evolved and what you've moved forward to. And we talked about the idea a little bit of American exceptionalism and nationalism and that sort of thing that's present in these veterans, especially as they get into the 1890s and further. I think it really flares up. Now, there's a really specific thing here in Seattle that helps really cement the relationship between Union and Confederate veterans. That's really struck as, it really seems peculiar to me and not something I've seen anywhere else. In that World War I and the Spanish-American War really drive these two groups of men together here, because it's their sons, their grandsons going off to fight the war. And you start to see a ton of language out of the Confederate veterans that mirrors almost word for word what the Union veterans have to say about these conflicts and these things. And there's some specific events. In 1912, the first time that Confederate veterans were formally invited to participate in the Memorial Day parade in Seattle, which was a big event, thousands and thousands of people. I mean, we had 3,000 veterans living in the city in 1905, so it's a large segment of the population. But Confederates had been excluded formally. Some of them in their 1880s had participated in events. They would kind of go to each other's burial plots and put flowers, that kind of stuff. But 1912, May Day of 1912, the communist groups and the international workers of the world do a procession, you want to say, or a rally here in Seattle. They are leading the procession with the red communist flag, and they carry the American flag furled up at the back of the procession. The veterans go absolutely ballistic over this because they're religious reverence for the flag, and they're so nationalistic at this point. Street fights break out between Spanish-American War veterans and the communists, and the Civil War veterans are getting involved, and they're filling the courthouse the next day in these arenas trying to get legislation passed about flags and leading processions. I mean, the city loses its mind over this communist thing. And the Confederate veterans write a big thing in the newspaper about how they formally, as a group, support the Union veterans and their feelings about the flag, and we are 100% behind everything the Union veterans are doing here. And the Union veterans formally invite them to the Memorial Day parade that year. The city of Seattle goes nuts when the Confederate veterans have their little car, but they keep the Confederate flag furled out of deference to the Union veterans. It's such a strange event for them to come together like that. And from that point forward, man, every year they go to each other's Memorial Day observations. They put up monuments. They're both at the cornerstone and dedication ceremonies. There's a visible unification of these two groups publicly more than ever on this idea of American pride and nationalism and these foreigners that are coming, rabble rousers, unionists, coming, or union, labor people would. I don't know the IWW history that well, but it's a curious merging point for those men to have come together. And I don't know of anything else like that. And I was curious do you see other issues beyond those staged sort of reconciliation ideas of 1913, 1938 reunions that really drive them together?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting story, by the way, one I've never heard. And when I'm done, I'm gonna bring up a book that it just came out that you might find interesting. But of course, there's Nina Silber's book, Romance of Reunion, which I'm sure you're familiar with and your listeners are familiar with. It's a very good book on national reconciliation. And she talks about the Spanish-American War. And that's something that I think is very symbolic of the final gesture of reconciliation when Fitzhugh Lee and William Rosser, these old Confederate veterans, they're old guys now. And it's really symbolic, that they put on new uniforms, they go off to lead troops and, the sons of Union and Confederate veterans to fight a common enemy. That's really, I think, what they need is a common enemy. And your story suggests that to me. They have the common enemy.
Common enemy, yeah.
Yeah, and in what you said was 1912?
1912, yeah.
Okay, so we haven't gotten to the Bolshevik Revolution yet.
No.
But, I can see that happening, especially after 1917, 1918 into the 1920s, when there's a real presence. And after the war, so many ideas coming from Eastern Europe and from people fleeing that, coming into the United States with these ideas like communism and socialism, anarchism, and what have you. I can see these guys teaming up against that in a nationalistic effort. I don't know of anything like that happening in Los Angeles either, which would be fascinating if I could find something. But the book, I'm going to hang on. I'm going to take this off for a second. I'm going to grab something off.
Okay. Yeah. For you guys, if you're interested, throw any questions or comments or things you have in the comments, because we can see anything live here as we go. So if there's something you want to know more about what Keith is saying or a question you have for him, stick them in the comments here, because we'll have plenty. We have another 25 minutes to go, so we do have time to answer your questions here as well. So yeah, you got the book.
This is a book that I just read and I reviewed. It's called Grand Arming of Labor, Workers,
I've heard of it.
Workers, Veterans, and the Meaning of the Civil War by Matthew Stanley. It's an interesting book that kind of goes the counter narrative of what you were just saying. And these are Union veterans who were very socialist leaning in their sensibilities. Very much would have been very much involved in labor unions and workers parties and populist parties that focused on labor and that sort of thing. And what they were saying was that all labor is enslaved labor, and that the Civil War was merely the first step in fixing all of this stuff by getting rid of racial slavery. Now it's time to get rid of the rest of it. And that would be like, these were straight up socialists, right? And so I think that Stanley makes too much of so many Union veterans being on board with this, because I found that most Union veterans would have thought that these guys were anti-American and would have drummed them out of pretty much any organization that they turned up at. But still, it's a really interesting book that talks about a very small segment of Union veterans that use their experience in the Civil War in a way that I had never really talked about before, and hardly anybody does talk about before. Has talked about, and so it's an interesting piece. How there is a small segment of Union veterans that look at their experience in the Civil War as the very beginning of a much more protracted war against the enslavement of all laboring people. Yeah,
there is one of the kind of early Grand Army of the Republic founders here in Washington Territory. We didn't have the Grand Army till 1878 here. It was pretty late forming. They were all members of the Department of California before they started their own. But one of them was an Irishman. He was an officer. He had married a daughter of a Confederate officer in Richmond. He was the Grand Army of the Republic founder. She was the founder of the United Daughters of the Confederacy chapter in post here. Talk about a divided household. And they would have events for the two, both in their same house. I really want to get into him. But he was Irish of birth, and he has those kind of ideas. I've read he's very outspoken, and he writes about that stuff, about fairness and labor and these kind of things, and it's really interesting. But the overwhelming bit of it is very much they're anti-American and so on. There's a Confederate veteran. He's a fascinating guy. He's every bit of the reconciliationist Confederate Reconstructed Confederate you could imagine. Friends with Lew Wallace in Indiana after the Civil War. He was a lawyer here in Seattle. Spoke to the territorial legislature on Abraham Lincoln. Gave a speech. A former Confederate speaking about the virtues of Abraham Lincoln. It's a fascinating dude. Only Civil War soldier to ever compete in the Olympic Games, and he won 3 medals in 1904 in St. Louis. Really? Crazy life. And he was intensely nationalistic. And he made a speech about these, there's all kinds of slang language for these foreigners and communists and socialists and whatever, about that it's a cancer that needs to be removed from society with a scalpel. And if we can't do it precisely, we need to do it with the shotgun and the bayonet. And all the Union veterans are clapping, and they're talking about this at flagpole installation ceremonies. And I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and it really drew them together. So maybe I have to do the counter to that book and a specific case study of, like, they were ready to really go to war, and they were fighting them in the streets in Seattle. There's one small town on the coast called I forget the name of the town, where violence was starting to erupt between the IWW people, the Wobblies, and the Civil War veterans. In this town, gifted 2 old Civil War veterans canes with inscribed gold-tipped handles on them in replacement, because they had beat down these wobbly guys and broke their previous canes. So the city bought them new canes. Thank you for your service to the town of whatever. It's fascinating stuff. It really is, and it's weird to see them, like, from that point forward. They're really kind of in lockstep with a lot of stuff, and the language tones down about the wrongness of the cause. You don't see that stuff anymore in joint ceremonies, and I don't know if it's so different here. I can't find anything comparable. I don't know if they were like that in California or San Francisco, Arizona, Denver.
It's hard to say. I mean, the stuff that I've done, and honestly, strangely, as though I live in Los Angeles, I haven't done a ton of work on veterans in Los Angeles. I mean, I've found all their burial places. In fact, I was just today at a cemetery that was close to my house, Hollywood Forever Cemetery, it's called. There's lots of famous people, and Cecil B. DeMille and Douglas Fairbanks and those kind of guys were all, Judy Garland, they're all buried there, right?
Oh, wow.
But also, it's a cemetery that's been around since the earliest days of Los Angeles, and there's lots of Civil War veterans buried there. There are scattered Union veterans here and there. Most of the GAR plot is in a place called Angeles Rosedale, which is closer to downtown. But there is a Confederate plot at Hollywood Forever, a small plot. There's about 30 Confederate veterans there. And up until, it's an interesting story, they had a Confederate monument, small Confederate monument, about 15 feet high. It was a stone, and on that stone was 3 Confederate flags, including 2 political flags, which is interesting for a soldier's plot. 2 political flags, and it was dedicated by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And that monument was taken down a few years ago amidst all the monument controversy. And the strange thing about this story is that the monument is now back, but they've taken, like, the rock is there, but they've taken the Confederate symbols off of it. So now it's just a big rock, and you can see where the plaque used to be. And so I don't entirely, I'm still sorting through what that message is. Like, so here's kind of like 3/4 of the monument without the controversial stuff, but you know what we really need. I'm not really sure. But they seem pretty separate to me. And then the stuff that goes on in Southern California and Los Angeles always seems pretty separate. There's the Soldiers' Home, which is where the National Cemetery is in Westwood by UCLA. The Soldiers' Home there was for Union veterans only. And the National Cemetery is for Union veterans only. There's no Confederates out there. The Confederates there's Confederates buried all over the place, but there's none at the national cemeteries. Like there are in Arlington, right? There are Confederate soldiers buried in Arlington. None out here. And they kept, as far as I can tell, they kept pretty separate. And I believe most of them came to Southern California, the Civil War veterans, where it was either for financial investment, because land was cheap and plentiful, And if you were into citrus, for example, that might be the place for you. Or if you were into land speculation, like Huntington, these guys, then this could be a place for you. But it was also mainly and primarily, I think, for the salubrious climate. With consumption just destroying people's lungs in the 19th century, you come in here for the nice, dry, warm most of the year, dry weather. And there were entire resorts that were built to house these guys to come and, try to live a more comfortable life when they were suffering from tuberculosis. And so I think that's what gets a lot of these Civil War veterans. There were lots of them. If you go to the National Plot in Westwood, I mean, there are lots and lots of Civil War veterans there. And they're all over the place. There's a big place, a big platform in Pasadena. Angeles Rosedale, like I said, they're all over.
I'm curious if there's a Confederate plot, because we have one here in Seattle. It's just specifically dedicated, but was bought by they founded a Southern Memorial Association, and the veterans and UDC teamed up to buy this. But they had claimed, of course, that it was the only Confederate burial plot west of the Rocky Mountains. Now I know that that's not entirely true. But even that, I got some pictures. I didn't get so super prepared with digital images, but if anybody can see these. So this is Seattle's Confederate Monument. Let me see. It says blue and the gray, pay honor to the heroic dead. It was primarily a Confederate ceremony to put this up. This was also torn down 2 years ago. Some people climbed. It's a private cemetery. They climbed over the walls. They went in with toe straps and flipped it over. It is now gone. Here's another interesting photo of it. Grand Army attends Confederate. These are just my tour notebooks, so hopefully you guys can see them. This is the flag of the 8th Virginia, which was in the private collection of that cemetery from the UDC that used to fly over this monument. It's a small, I think there's 10 or 11 guys buried there. But the dedication of this monument is extremely interesting. So, of course, it's UDC, and it was 1926. The number of Confederates they had rock from Stone Mountain, Georgia, granite shipped across Panama and up the Pacific coast to build this thing. But they had Union soldiers present, and there was an interview where they're asking one of them, like, "What do you think of this?" This first time, he says, "It's the first time I've seen this Confederate flag since the war." And he's kind of like, "But we're all here together, so we're pals," and it doesn't come up. But super interestingly is the color detail that raised these colors over the flag. I'll get back to the picture. I don't know if we can see it, but in the other picture, there's a flagpole that's a little behind this fellow here. American flag on top, Confederate flag on the bottom. The two soldiers, I'm backwards here. This fellow here, the two soldiers were U.S. Navy or National Guard or something troops that were African American. And the Confederates specifically had current black soldiers, raise the American and Confederate flag during the dedication ceremony to this monument, which throws a huge wrench into a lot of what the story was. And it makes me think, they were probably not like, well, we better get some for optics. We better get some black guys here. I don't think it was that. I think there was probably 1926, they weren't real keen on getting black people involved in much of anything, even here in Seattle. Right. So it's a really curious thing that the Confederate veterans made that decision to have them be the ones that stand by that flag, those two flags as they went over. And I wouldn't believe it, but when you zoom in on a better version of that photo, you can tell like that's a black man in uniform standing at attention at the base of that monument and flagpole. It gets messy here in Seattle, making sense of all this stuff. You got the communist war, and you got the black guys putting the Confederate flag up at the monument, and it's just, but yet they're still throwing shots at each other in their speeches, and so that stuff is still there. It's a unique world for sure.
I would really love to hear the story behind that and why they had that one individual there. But I think you're right. I mean, these things do get extremely messy. It's not always a simple story behind all this stuff, which is why I think history is such a great thing. It's fun for me because I love complexity and I love nuance and I love throwing something like this into the mix. Okay, well, that sounds great, but how do you explain this? And it becomes difficult, and sometimes you can't explain it. Sometimes, who knows why that guy was there? I would in your research, you'll probably figure it out one of these days. But, maybe he was the guy that was available. Maybe he was pissed. Who knows?
Who knows? They might have hated those black guys. Might have been ready to beat everybody's ass for having put them there. We can't say for sure, but it's captivating that it even happened. And that's what I find is taking general concepts, like you said, with some of these books, like what David Blade has to say or others have had to say, and then continuing to take it down the pyramid, I guess, and refine it specifically to locally here. The general stuff still applies. Everything you've said in your book, in what you've said tonight, applies widely to the veterans here. But then there's all this stuff that completely doesn't apply to it. And it's I love it. It drives me forward, and it's changed my direction. I started off I'm going to talk about what they did at Gettysburg and, with the war history stuff. And now it's like this, social science history of anthropology of these guys and their culture. And it's the mission has creeped a lot.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that, because one of the things I tell my students all the time is, like, you might start off in one direction and you have to follow the evidence, and wherever the evidence takes you. I mean, you might have preconceived, my gut might tell you that you need to go one particular direction, but if the evidence suggests that there's some complexity here, you've got to follow the complexity. Otherwise, you're not being intellectually honest. I mean, it's easy for us to come up with our conclusions in advance, go back and cherry pick the 5 things that support our argument. But when you find something like this, it's gonna, and you may never explain this, but it needs some explanation, because it suggests to me anyway that the story in Seattle, which I really, until I've become more familiar with your work, knew nothing about. Because so much of this is in the East, right? All this stuff is in the East. I think a lot of people forget that there is a Civil War history on the West Coast too.
That's with I always begin all my tours and all my presentations of saying that the Civil War history and the history of whether it's Los Angeles or Seattle are not mutually exclusive, because the generations that built Seattle, that built not San Francisco, it had several decades head start on everybody, but any of the other smaller cities, LA, Albuquerque, all these cities were nothing at the time of the Civil War. Seattle, this is a generation that built it. And these are the same guys. Like when you go to Gettysburg and you look at the monuments and you ponder what happened here, I'm like, this guy was the civil engineer in Seattle that decided where the sewer lines were going to go. And it's all the same.
None of this stuff is simple either. I mean, I was just, one of the things that I do in my class is just, I do a quick local thing in my Civil War class, because the kids are interested in it. And, we talk about where California went in the election of 1860, for example. And California went in with Lincoln on this. Lincoln took California, but he took California in the northern counties. The southern counties went with John Breckinridge, the pro-slavery Southern Democrat. Los Angeles went with Breckinridge, and there were only a few hundred votes. He won by a comfortable margin. I think he won by a couple hundred votes in LA County, a county that now has 9.5 million people. Only had a handful at the time, but and there was even a little secessionist movement here in Los Angeles that the small contingent of Union soldiers had to go and suppress in 1861, right downtown where the plaza still exists. And so this stuff is messy, man.
Absolutely, it sure is. So while we wrap up here, we're again, if anybody has last minute questions, throw them in here. But where do you go from here? What's next? What are you working on? What are you thinking about? What's your a concrete project that you're working towards? But also what's inspiring you right now? What historians are you reading? What's got your attention? You pulled out a couple recent books. So
there's a couple of books that I really enjoyed recently. One of them is Elizabeth Barron's new book, so reimagining the Civil War, and I also really very much like Andrew Lang's new book on American exceptionalism, a contest of civilizations.
I need to read that.
It's a very dense book, and it takes a minute to get through. It's several hundred pages, and it's heavy stuff. But it's about American exceptionalism, and it's been very influential in my thinking in this last year, especially. It's about American exceptionalism, and he sees that American exceptionalism going all the way back to the founding of the nation, and this idea that the United States is unique in the context of Western nations, that it is better because of this, and that it's all guided by divine providence, is something that I found. It's like, wow, that's true. And how does this inform the generation that fought the Civil War? And really, how he frames it is that the Southerners and Northerners, generally speaking, had conflicting visions of what American exceptionalism actually meant. Slavery was at the root of all this, of course, and the expansion of slavery into the federal territories. That's what caused the crisis that erupted into disunion and the Civil War. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating, the way he takes this on, and it's informed my thinking about commemoration. And the project that I'm working on right now is about Gettysburg specifically, where there are hundreds of monuments and thousands of markers. Most of them United States. There's a handful of Confederate state monuments, but most of these markers are United States monuments. And I wanted to go back and revisit the dedications and see just how much of an American exceptionalist position Union veterans took. And when I found it's when you ask different questions, then these things come to light in an entirely different way. And what I had I'd missed or kind of didn't take as seriously as I should have before have now become kind of the focus of my research. And it's just how American exceptionalists were these guys, and it turns out that they really were. It's something that I think in the 21st century, especially as a secular nation, we don't really take as seriously as we should how devout 19th century Americans were and how they believed they were doing God's work, and when they frame their dedication speeches in this way, it is imperative that the United States win this. In reflecting on Abraham Lincoln's 1862 speech to Congress, that the United States is the last best hope of earth, and if they lose, then they've lost it all, and they've gone against the will of God. And so it made absolute sense that they won, that it was God's will that they won. And that puts another wrinkle in the reconciliationist story, and it really shines a light on American exceptionalist values as they were in the 19th century. We've moved away from that a lot, and now American exceptionalism is just sort of, I think, dismissed or discounted as mindless patriotism or mindless nationalism, which I don't think that it is. I mean, I think a lot of people can fall into that category, but that's 21st century politics, which is not what we're doing here. These 19th century guys, I think, really took this stuff seriously. And really knew about it and could discuss it intelligently. Yeah,
I agree. It's something. It's a line of thinking I've flirted with, because I don't, you don't want to. I've taken enough exits off the freeway of where I thought I was going with this that sometimes I think, I come across a new question. I'm like, this deserves my attention. This deserves my study. And sometimes I'm like, man, I'll get to this someday. In that aspect of things, especially when you overlay that with, you had said about Los Angeles versus San Francisco and Seattle being cities that at least with Seattle, its formative era was the late 1880s, early 1890s through 1902, the end of the Klondike Gold Rush. And that's when these veterans were at their peak of influence in Seattle and their civics, government, judges, attorneys, physicians, engineers, leaders in church and in society. They were really at their peak. And I wonder how that thinking that you just talked about, in that American exceptionalism and those ideas become embedded in what these places become, specifically because of how they steered it. And Washington's a little different because it was territorial until 1889. So we had appointed governors and things like that allowed that to manifest even further, because U.S. Grant decides who's going to be the governor of the Washington Territory, not the voters. And I really want to get into those ideas of how does it. Sherman was here in 1883 and 1886, and he gave tremendous speeches about how you are the men to lead this nation into its next stage of prosperity and pan-Pacific leadership and all this stuff. So they knew what they were doing in that regard. Like you said, they can express it. And if I can tie that concretely to the lives of these men and how that influence shaped this place, to this day would be captivating kind of study. So I'll wait till that your book comes out, and then I can use that to launch into. I can narrow it down to the Seattle edition of that. And
yeah, for sure.
It'd be fun. So, well, hey, I know we're getting on close to an hour here. We don't have any questions tonight. That's super sad. We usually get a lot, but maybe we're just blowing everybody away and they can't even comprehend what you've had to say so far. They're processing.
You can always hit me up. I mean, I dumped all my social media platforms, except it got too crazy for me. I couldn't deal with it.
Yeah, I get it.
But except Instagram, I'm still on Instagram. I'm there at Keith Harris History. Easy to find, easy to spell. And my website's keithharrishistory.com. Not particularly clever names, but easy to find anyway. So you can always find me in these places if there's any questions.
Yeah. And anybody that's watching, if you've liked anything we talked about, get this book for sure. Support.
Yeah. Well, if you guys can still hear me, it looks like Richard has been cut off. So I guess I will close this myself. It says everyone can see and hear me, so I suppose I still can. But anyway, it looks like he's cut off, and that was a very interesting conversation, I thought, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you like it, read the book, let me know what you think. And of course, like I was saying before, you can find me on Instagram at Keith Harris History. So I'm going to sign off, and peace.